Oh, this is Reverend Don Lewis coming to you from the beautiful metaverse, and more particularly from beautiful Danville, Illinois, homeland of the Corellian tradition. And this is Midday with Reverend Don, and welcome. And as you know, if you follow Midday with Reverend Don, you can type your comments or questions into whatever platform you happen to be watching the program on, and it will show up here in my chat room, and we can talk directly. And today, I thought we would continue our conversation about death of the pagan, pagan funerals, pagan death practices, um, and generally look at some of these issues. And yesterday we were talking specifically about funerals, and the first pagan funeral I ever conducted. Hello to Renee in the chat room; it's good to see you. Was my own mother's funeral, which was a bit of an experience. But it did allow me to perform one last major service for her, um, which was very satisfying in its way. It was also quite nerve-wracking, as you can imagine. But I also have to say I don't. Um, I remember less about doing it than about the times before and after, because I was very into it. Because my primary purpose was to give her a good send-off. And that's what you want to do in a funeral, regardless of who you're officiating for. If you're the officiating clergy, you're giving them a good send-off, and you're giving that both for their spirit and for their family. And you want everyone to feel as good as they can after that has happened. Now, being pagans, we have a strong belief in the afterlife, and for many of us, it's more than just a belief. It's something we've experienced either through near-death experience in our own right or through mediumistic experiences in our careers. And that does change, I think, for many of us, how we feel about death and funerals. I notice that most people who write on this subject have not taken that into account. And I will grant you that for many pagans who are raised as Christians, maybe it's not as profound because old tapes are still playing in their head. But I think that when you have a full understanding that the soul is eternal, the understanding of both the part of the soul that becomes the ancestor and the part that is reincarnated, you have a different attitude toward death. The part that will continue to speak with the living, the part that moves forward in its journey. And it's a very different point of view than if you think death is the end of everything, or if you think that it is something that can lead to negative consequences, as in certain other world religions. The one thing we really don't have for the most part, at least in the versions of modern Western paganism I'm familiar with, is we don't have a negative afterlife in most of our understandings. I will grant you, I do believe that what the person expects in their afterlife is going to help to create it. And I guess if they're expecting something negative, they could start out that way, but I don't believe they'll stay that way. And even then, I don't know how likely they are to actually get that. I've heard of people who have had near-death experiences who made that claim, but they don't seem to have ever gotten all the way over. And it was more their fear than their experience. And hello to Mary in the chat room. I highly encourage studying people's near-death experiences, people's past life experiences, and see what people have actually said. If you happen to have had an experience of your own, well, you don't really need to do that, but it can still be informative. Because, the idea that no one has ever talked about this, no one's ever come back and told us what's there, is absolutely false. Lots of people have had such experiences, and they tend to say about the same things. I've heard of attempts to explain this away in various forms, but I don't particularly find that convincing. You can find this all the way back into antiquity. Um, and the one thing we can definitely say about our earliest historical ancestors is that they all had a strong belief in life after death. They demonstrated it with their practices. Um, and I think that as modern Western pagans, we must um, continue to have this belief. It changes everything about life. I've remarked on the fact that I am definitely in the last part of my life. Now, I may have 10, 20 years still ahead of me, but compared to what's behind me, that's the last part of my life. And I find that I'm looking at it very differently. Um, my years as a father, for example, have given way to being a grandfather. Um, my The ways in which I'm likely to continue to pursue any role of public activity are going to be different in the future than in the past. And I'm applying that to my life. And if you're in this part of life also, I think you should be considering these things too. One of the reasons we were talking about funerals this week is that I had not intended to be here tomorrow. I had intended to be at an appointment pre-planning my own funeral. That appointment has been changed. I will be here tomorrow. But I mentioned this because, again, I'm not expecting to die anytime soon. I might very well have 20 more years. But why am I pre-planning my funeral? The same reason you should, so that it's taken care of, so that my wishes are very clear, and so that it's not a burden on my survivors. And if it does happen 20 years from now, I will have scored a bargain because the price will have gone up by then. Um, but I could also be hit by a bus tomorrow. You never know what's going to happen. And um, it's good to be prepared. We were talking yesterday about how many things, when you are, well, for example, a modern Western pagan, how many things could possibly interfere with your plans, including the fact that your next of kin may be someone who isn't actually that close to you and may have their own anticipations. If you have made your wishes known, if they're part of your will, if they are set out um, in unbreakable ways, such as having prearranged the funeral already, it's very hard for that not to be what happens by comparison to if you have left nothing in writing. Um, if you have left nothing in writing and your next of kin is a third cousin you haven't seen for 30 years, you don't know what you're going to get. And for some of us that doesn't matter. For others of us it does. In my mind, the funeral is very important both for the spirit and for the living. I come from the point of view that many spirits, and I think mine will be one of them, want to see that the proper actions are taken as a sign of the relationships that existed. And for the funeral, it is a send-off, a commemoration. It carries a certain importance, I think, really to the whole of the lifetime. And I still remember Lady Victoria talking about how this had happened to a number of prominent pagan high priesthood in the 70s and early 80s, who had ended up with radically Christian funerals because the people planning them were not part of their pagan life. And I think that this is severely problematic when it happens. For one thing, it undercuts everything that you did in life if you were pagan high priesthood or archpriesthood, and that is not good. It undercuts your legacy, I think. And so I think it's very important to have your will, both literally and figuratively, set out very clearly. I want to take a moment and wish a happy birthday to my nephew Jason, whose birthday is today, which is obviously why I'm wishing him happy birthday. Happy birthday, Jason. And I hope everyone is having a good day. Um, this is one of the things, the importance of preparing for what you want, um, which we talk about in my new book, which is coming soon, the Corellian Book of the Dead. It has an ETA of November 11th. And we talk about both the importance of why you need to set this up in advance and what some of the effects of it are. And some of the effects are, it will be for many people the last thing they remember about you. Um, and it absolutely can affect how they see you under certain circumstances, um, including if there's nothing. So I think it's something that we need to pay attention to. But let's talk about some other things that are part of pagan death practices. In the Corellian tradition, we're very big on honoring the ancestors. And there are a lot of different ways to do this, including having a daily relationship with them, which I think is probably the most important thing. But, also honoring their ancestral anniversaries, I think is a very important thing, either the date of their birth or the date of their death. And I think that the spirits themselves appreciate this, but it also helps you to keep their memory alive. And we say, what is remembered lives. And we've talked about this the last several days in a row. I do believe that our memory of the ancestors doesn't exactly keep them alive, but it does keep them focused and interested when they might otherwise become dormant. And, for some people, depending on the lives they led, that's perfectly fine. There's no need to remain involved in this world when you've crossed over, because no one's expecting you to. No one's necessarily going to appreciate it very much, but for others of us, it's a very different situation. It's a situation where people do want their ancestors to guide them and watch over them, where they do want to have that relationship with them. And in traditional paganism, this was a very important thing in almost all branches. And I'm very pleased to have, over the basically 50 years of my pagan career, watched this become important in modern Western paganism. Now, I can remember a point in time when Corellians were the only people who talked about their ancestors on any regular basis. And most Western pagans wanted nothing to do with their ancestors. They subscribed, for the most part, to the thought that their ancestors were following a different path and wouldn't want to be involved, or they didn't want them involved. And as I've said before, this is not my understanding of how our relationship with our ancestors work. Where the ancestors are, it doesn't really matter what they believed in life. What they see is what's there. And it's been my experience that whatever they may have believed in life, what you'll experience of them as an ancestor is their higher self coming from a good place. If you experience something else, it's not in fact an ancestor, it's a ghost. They have not fully crossed over, or you're censoring them, one or the other. But when they've crossed over, those things aren't going to be a problem. So working with the ancestors, I think, is very important. But I will have to say, when I work with my ancestors, it's not every person I was ever related to. I mean, they may be there in the congregation, so to speak, but it's certain specific ancestors that I work with, and most people do too. It's the ones who are most important to them. Sometimes the ones who are most important in the familial line. Sometimes it's philosophical ancestors that they never knew in this lifetime, but have come to them as spirits. And building that relationship is very important. And part of it is honoring those anniversaries. But more importantly, the anniversaries give you a chance to bring the community together to continue to remember important ancestors. And again, some ancestors are people you'll want to remember on the 100th anniversary of their birth. Others, People, may not be anyone who remembers the 100th anniversary of their birth. It all depends. Um, there are certainly people I'm related to that I've never heard from as an ancestor, um, which makes me a little bit less likely to honor their particular anniversary, um, simply because I haven't had that relationship with them. But those that I do, I think it's an important thing. And we talk about why this is important in the book. Why building a relationship with the ancestors is so important. You know, just because you haven't built a relationship with your ancestors doesn't mean they don't have one with you. But it will mean that it's likely to be closer and that you'll be more aware of what's going on. Um, your ancestors, at least in theory, are watching over you and working with you no matter what's happening, no matter whether you're aware of it or not. But you may be resisting them just as much as they're working to help you if you don't have a relationship with them and understand what's going on. So I think that the relationship is very, very important. And I think it's something that we definitely need to continue to work on, particularly in the Corellian tradition and anywhere else where you have an interest in ancestors. Now, um, I think it's very interesting to look at some of the historical practices around death and where they come from. One of the big historical practices around death is covering the mirrors in a household when a person dies. And it used to be, maybe 100 years ago, that this was still a fairly common practice. And there were a number of ideas behind it, one of which was so that the gaze of the deceased would not be caught by the mirror and hold them back. But mirrors have been very important in funeral customs going far into antiquity. It was very important, for example, in Etruscan funeral customs. You find them heavily in Egyptian funeral customs, where the word for life and the word for mirror are the same word. Um, Now, one of the ideas was that when a person dies, and you find this when you work with people's um, near-death experiences, when they first die, they don't necessarily know they're dead, and they don't necessarily immediately remember who they were. Um, Often mirrors are put there to help them to remember. Um, and usually that memory will come back a little bit at a time. Sometimes it never leaves at all. It depends on the person. But mirrors had an important role in many funeral rites for that reason. And covering the mirror in the house is partly for that reason, to not detain the spirit, but let it go forward. That's also why it used to be when a person died in a house, every window would be opened to make sure they could easily find their way out. Um, there was also a custom that when it was time to remove the body from the house, um, it went feet first to make it a little bit harder for them to find their way back in if they decided to try to do such a thing. All of this has to do with two things. One is fear of the deceased, which many people had, but also the desire for them to be able to move forward in their procession. And that could be both to move on to their next incarnation, to whatever was waiting for them in the afterlife, but also as an ancestor. It's to prevent them being caught between the worlds, becoming a ghost. We talked about that a little bit the other day, that sometimes people get caught between the worlds. They don't properly cross over, usually because of something highly emotional, and it will tend to hold them. And there are things you can do to help them to move forward. There are things that will happen naturally to help them move forward. Their guides will be continuing to try to help them move forward. It's all a matter of what they can accept where they're at and understand where they're at. And it's not uncommon that if someone is caught, it'll be hard to get them to accept anything for a while. Um, but part of this also, and I commented before, when I was younger and learning these things, I was taught that, either you're caught between the worlds or you're not. I've come to realize through experience that what's caught between the worlds is only part of the person's energy, and it's part of what we call the shadow. So when you, as a living person, look at your shadow, one of the things that may very well be in there are aspects of past lives that never completely crossed. That's why some of the things that you'll find yourself doing in shadow work don't always seem to apply to you today, but a part of you from some other time. And these things too are important to go back and heal. We talked about some of the famous examples of ghosts, but let's talk about a couple of others. Um, some of the things that are famous examples of ghosts are people who are seen walking in the same place, like the widow walking in the widow's walk, waiting for the ship's captain to return. That's a famous New England ghost story. The person who's seen in the library, but only ever in the library, and always looking for a particular book, or perhaps several particular books. Um, the person sitting in the rocking chair, but you never see them anywhere else. And this is because it's only a particular part of their energy that's caught. They're doing that same thing. Now, that's not always true. Sometimes more of the energy is caught, and you'll have more of a developed personality there to deal with. Um, but most historical ghost stories deal with only a very particular part of the energy. Some of the famous curse stories that you'll find in European history are good examples of that. A person who was killed unjustly and places a curse on the person who killed them. Um, Sometimes what will then haunt that house um, for a long time after, but only in reference to that point. A famous example is the Screaming Skull um, from a famous English country house. I can't remember the name of the country house off the top of my head. It doesn't matter. You can go look it up. It's easy to find. Um, but it's an example of a famous ghost story. But the ghost attached to that skull is connected to only one thing. Um, and that is to their death. And I just received a message that brings me a little emotion. I've just been informed that David Hobgood passed away last night. Now, chances are you have never heard that name. In the pagan world, he was better known as David Spellsinger. And I have not seen him for many, many years, but he was once a very good friend. If you read our updates on the Pagan Leadership Conference, you'll see that he was the person, and Sir Edward has just placed this into the chat room, that did the opening benedictions for that gathering. Now, he was quite a dynamic priest. He practiced an extraordinarily syncretic tradition. He was heavily involved in martial arts. He was quite an interesting man. I'm very sorry to hear that he has crossed, and I will certainly spend some time um, speaking to his spirit. Now, Melanie says, I remember him. He was at many events throughout the years. Yes, he was. He came from the farther reaches of greater Chicagoland, which is northern Indiana, but he was very involved. And I'm sad to hear of his crossing, not in the sense, as we were talking earlier, that I'm necessarily sad for him, because I do know life only continues when we cross. But sad to know that I will not get to see him again. That that his direct contributions to this world have ended. And it's very interesting to have this happen during this broadcast, or to receive the information during this broadcast. Um, you know, it reminds us that we all die. And I would like to think in the pagan community we're quite aware of this. But I know that there are many others in the world who are at great pains to deny death any role in their life, which does not stop death from eventually taking a role in their life. Um, as I was saying at the start of the program, I'm looking at making certain that that whenever my life comes to an end, the details have been taken care of and are not left to other people to do. Um, I think that everyone nearing the end of their life should look at that, because we don't know what's coming. The last thing in the world I expected was that piece of news. Um, and unless I'm mistaken, about someone who is younger than myself. Although I might be in error in that he might have been slightly older now that I think about it. Um, but even so, one of my contemporaries. And you know, they say that you know that you become old when you hear about your friends most commonly in the obituary section. Um, but there's a certain truth in that. And I think that, if I were asked for my advice for growing older, my first piece of advice is don't hang out with just old people. Know as many young people as you can and continue to interact with them. The more young people you know, the younger you're going to remain. Then the second is be prepared for what you cannot really be prepared for. Because again, we never know when our moment will come or what it's going to be. Um, and so being prepared for it is not entirely possible. But there are many things that we absolutely can do to prepare ourselves for that end when it comes. And in talking about pagan death rites and practices, I really think this needs to become one of them for those of us who are older. One of the things we've heard about a lot in the last few years are elders complaining that no one ever listens to them. I'm not going to go into my normal diatribe on that. Um, but that too is part of this. Looking to your legacy, making sure your legacy is as well developed as it can be, making sure you have done the things you wanted to do, none of which involves other people listening to you, by the way. It involves what you do. I've said before, and it's still true, I don't think I ever felt more listened to and respected overall than I have in the last few years, when so many of these other people felt they were not being listened to. And I think that that this is a very important thing to remember, that we're not just preparing our funeral, we're not just considering what are we leaving behind to our children or other heirs, but to the world. And because when that moment comes, it comes unexpectedly. And the more we've done to prepare for it, the happier we're going to be. With that, I see we've come to the end of our half hour. I will be back tomorrow. I want to thank you all for joining me. I love all of you. And let us close with our prayer, as we normally do. Divine Mother Goddess, Divine Father God, beloved ancestors, we thank you for the role you play in our lives. We thank you for all the help and advice you give to us. And we pray that you will continue to guide us both in this life and afterwards. And I ask you, to be with the spirit of David as he goes forward on his journey in whatever form he understands you, and to help him there, as one day you will help all of us, to help him to move forward to a happy and joyful afterlife, and to help we who knew him to remember him well. Divine Mother Goddess, Divine Father God, beloved ancestors, we thank you with great love and thanks for this and everything you do in our lives, and we know you're always here. But from respect, we thank you for your presence. May you be blessed now and always. And I thank you for your presence, and may you be blessed now and always. And again, I'll see you tomorrow.